The Russian Navy is facing increasing challenges in the Baltic Sea as NATO and its new members try to block Russian ships. Sweden, which joined NATO in 2024, has deployed a new anti-ship missile, the RBS-15 Mark III, capable of hitting Russian ships in St Petersburg and Kaliningrad, writes defense analyst David Axe in an article for the Telegraph. Sweden will receive a significant capability increase with an anti-ship missile featuring a more advanced target seeker, increased range and a larger warhead, said Görgen Johansson, a Saab executive. The RBS-15 Mark III, which is radar-guided, has a range of up to 190 kilometers, can attack ships and large targets. Combined with sensors on land, in the air, on the water and underwater, the missiles effectively block Russian warships from accessing the Atlantic Ocean. The Russian Navy is facing pressure from more than just Sweden. Sweden's growing anti-ship missile arsenal was less threatening to Russia before the latter widened its war on Ukraine in February 2022 and drove Sweden, once NATO-leaning but formerly neutral, into the transatlantic alliance. Sweden joined NATO in March 2024. Its neighbor Finland, also a former neutral state, had joined 11 months prior. Other Baltic countries have significantly beefed up their defenses. Estonia has purchased Blue Spear 5G missiles with a range of 200 miles, while Latvia has acquired naval strike missiles. The chosen weapons system will form the cornerstone of Estonian naval defense for decades to come, said Yuri Saska, commander of the Estonian Navy. With NATO expansion and the addition of Sweden and Finland, the Baltic Sea has become one of the most challenging regions for the Russian Navy. This calls into question its ability to effectively operate in a conflict with NATO. Axe writes that it remains an open question whether the Russian Navy can resist in the Baltic Sea if tensions with NATO escalate into open warfare. It is noted that NATO's expansion in reaction to the Russian attack on Ukraine has made the Baltic Sea an extremely hostile place for the Russian Navy, and it's growing even more hostile with every missile Sweden and its fellow NATO members deploy. The elite Ukrainian special forces capitalized on their momentum and launched a decisive counterattack in the Kherson region near Kruglenko, targeting the exhausted North Korean troops in a forested area, according to Euromaidan press media outlet. Benefiting from their superior skills and modern equipment, they dealt a decisive blow to the enemy before the North Koreans could consolidate control over this territory. The Ukrainian aim was to neutralize the remaining North Korean troops, clear this sector of the front line, and reclaim strategic positions near Kruglenko. Euromaidan press says that this effort was critical in preventing the enemy from consolidating their foothold and ensuring the front line remained stable. Ukrainian special forces capitalized further on their momentum from a successful tank raid on Mykolaiivka, which we discussed in a previous report. So they launched the counterattack with the dual goal of eliminating enemy survivors and pushing the front line back to Kruglenko. Reclaiming this area was essential to disrupt Russian plans for further offensives and to safeguard Ukrainian positions near Malaya Lochnia. Ukrainian special forces sought to exploit a moment of vulnerability after a series of disastrous North Korean assaults on Malaya Lochnia, where the deployed enemy units had been left heavily depleted. Because North Koreans fought almost until the last man was dead, these units suffered catastrophic losses due to poor coordination and a near-total absence of fire support from Russian forces. Ukrainians' intelligence reports estimate approximately 4,000 North Korean casualties in the region attributed to Russia's neglect in providing adequate artillery and logistical support. To achieve their objectives, Ukrainian operators relied on rapid assaults backed by extensive fire support. Equipped with thermal scopes, these elite forces operated with unparalleled precision. Advanced technology allowed them to detect enemy positions as the North Korean soldiers were heavily contrasted against the cold and snowy background, which made the Ukrainians much more effective, according to Euromaidan press. The North Korean troops had already taken positions in forested areas and houses, which provided them with natural and structural cover against Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance and drone strikes. Clearing such terrain required meticulous planning and could have exposed the Ukrainian special forces to ambushes. Additionally, the persistent risk of Russian reinforcements arriving to bolster the North Koreans added a layer of urgency to the operation. Ukrainian forces had to act decisively before the enemy could regroup and launch further assaults. The counterattack near Kruglenko began with camouflaged Ukrainian troops advancing into the forested area where North Korean soldiers were regrouping for an offensive. The Ukrainians opened fire, quickly neutralizing many of the enemy combatants. During the operation, they examined the bodies of fallen North Korean soldiers and discovered one survivor. As they attempted to take him prisoner, the soldier pulled a grenade, shouted a defiant cry, and detonated it, killing himself in an act of desperation. A Ukrainian soldier narrowly avoided injury, jumping back just in time.
During military operations in the Kursk region, Russian infantry faced the dilemma of crossing to the other side of the river. At the same time, the soldiers could not think of anything better than to drown two of their own BTRDs and lay wooden pallets on top of them to create a pedestrian crossing. This was reported on January the 17th by analysts from the Defense Express portal. Photos and even memes are already being actively distributed on social media, which emphasize the absurdity of such a decision. After all, there is no information on the preliminary serviceability or malfunction of the equipment used as a crossing on the internet. And this may indicate that the Russians could well have used their own completely serviceable armoured vehicles in such a rather comical way. At the same time, open sources contain information that the BTRD is a vehicle that can move across water at a speed of 10 km per hour forward and 1.5 km per hour backwards. That is, such an armoured vehicle can quite easily cope with water obstacles if used as intended and in accordance with technical features. But the Russians, as we can see, found a completely different use for the BTRD. If we assume that the equipment was faulty at the time of use as a crossing, then the actions of the Russian military can still be called inappropriate. The faulty armoured personnel carriers could well have been used to extract components that would be needed to repair other units of equipment. Of course, everything may turn out to be much more prosaic. Russian paratroopers tried to ford these rivers in their BTRDs, Defense Express suggests. However, even in this case, the situation remains comical. After all, instead of saving the equipment, the soldiers decided to leave everything as is and use the drowned vehicles to ford the river. Russia uses long-forgotten World War II technology to cross rivers in Kursk region. As Forbes columnist David Axe writes, during World War II, some armies, notably the British, attached metal spans to the top of tank chassis and used the resulting funny bridges to quickly cross gaps that stopped vehicles on the battlefield. 80 years later, in the Kursk region of Western Russia, Russian airborne troops are deploying modified BTRD amphibious vehicles in the same way, by piling what looks like wooden floors onto 13-ton tracked vehicles and rolling them into rivers. Sinking into the muddy riverbed, the vehicle's improvised services act as bridges, the analyst writes. While the BTRDs are as vulnerable to Ukrainian mines, missiles, artillery and drones as any combat vehicle, they are fast, capable of road speeds of around 40 miles per hour, That makes them less vulnerable than permanent bridges or slower engineering vehicles, the analyst writes.